A warm welcome to everybody. Today we have a very special event. We have a roundtable discussion on science diplomacy in times of war, organized by Professor Maria Rentezzi from the Friedrich-Alexander-Universität Erlangen-Nürnberg, in short, FAU. My name is Joachim Honecker. I'm the president of FAU, and I'm very much supporting this event. We are all quite affected by the happenings in Ukraine and the Russian invasion. And today we would like to discuss with researchers from all over the world the science diplomacy topic in times of war. Maria.
Thank you from my part as well. Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. A very warm welcome to this roundtable on science diplomacy in times of war. I would like to thank all of our panelists who have accepted our invitation to discuss this pressing issue this evening. As already the president said, my name is Maria Rentezzi. I'm professor and chair of science, technology, and gender studies at the FAU. And this event, I have to say, is organized by the FAU. And at this point, it's important to thank especially our president, because when I expressed this idea to him, he was like, yes, let's go. This is a very important issue and we should discuss it in public. It's absolutely important. So in addition to the FAU, we have two EU Horizon 2020 projects that helped us to co-organize this event. The first one is called InsSciDE. This program has been centered for the last 4 years on the development of a shared science diplomacy for Europe. This is our title. I'm currently leading a subgroup on science diplomacy and security, which is part of this program. And also my co-moderator and of course dear colleague Matthew Adamson, who is sitting across my office this evening, also takes part in this work. So the second project that is part of the organization is my own ERC Consolidator Grant that focuses on nuclear diplomacy and the historical role of the International Atomic Energy Agency in regulating nuclear issues on a global level. My own background is in the history of radioactivity and nuclear sciences. And the last years, together with other colleagues, including Matthew, we have extensively focused on the role science diplomacy has historically played in shaping international relations around the world. So, given the current events and the Russian war in Ukraine, I think we all felt that history and philosophy of science suddenly, and I think this is a new experience that at least I have, that we have a vital role to play in helping us decide what we want science diplomacy to mean in times of war, because it seems that the meaning is totally different, was totally different a few weeks ago. And also we want to help us decide on the kind of science policies we need to put in place in support of all scientists that are under threat at the moment. And here I want to include not only the Ukrainian scientists that are under threat, but also those Russians who oppose Putin's regime and are under threat as well. We shouldn't forget them as well. I was reading some of the news this afternoon, and I have to say that it's very indicative that yesterday, the International Science Council, which is a non-governmental international scientific body, circulated a letter where they admitted, and I quote what they said, the conflict in Ukraine will potentially set back our efforts by a decade or more. And by this, they refer to the role that science and technology could play and have been playing in addressing global challenges. So one of the issues that I really want us to discuss today is all these pressing issues that we have in front of us. And I have the privilege to moderate the event tonight together with my colleague Matthew Adamson. And Matthew, it's over to you.
Thank you, Maria. I'm very glad to be here. I'm Matthew Adamson, and I would like to express my gratitude as well to Professor Joachim Honecker for supporting this event, and to all of our panelists for their willingness to join this conversation today. It might be worth noting that, like Professor Rentezzi, in the past few years, as a historian of science, my attention too has been drawn to examining episodes in the history of science diplomacy and in the relationship between science, technology, and international affairs more generally. And it might also be worth noting that I serve as the secretary of an international scholarly body, the DHST Commission on Science, Technology, and Diplomacy. And it's worth mentioning because the founding of this commission took place in 2017, and it reveals that the community of historians of science, technology, and medicine have formally recognized science diplomacy as an important subject of historical research for several years now. So I anticipate that today's conversation is sure to add to the questions that community ought to be asking as historians and observers of science diplomacy. I'd also like to say just a word about housekeeping. Our panelists will each have a chance to respond to a question that we've generated beforehand for them. We anticipate that this will probably take about 60 minutes. When that's done, we will open up the virtual floor to questions. So for anyone who's watching online right now and on live stream, please know that you're very much encouraged to ask questions via the chat function on live stream. When you do so, we would kindly ask you not only to give us your question, but also if there's a particular panelist to whom you wish to address it, to please indicate that in your question. Thank you, and now I would like to return the floor to Maria Rintezi.
I'm really sorry I forgot to unmute myself. So I was saying thanks very much, and I'm delighted to welcome our first panelist, Mr. Vito Cecere, who is the Director for Research Policy and Academic Relations at Germany's Federal Foreign Office in Berlin. Actually, I want to say that if you want to read more information about our panelists, you can find their bios in our live stream site. So, Mr. Cecere, as far as I know, within 48 hours of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Germany, and it was the first country, decided to impose sanctions and, among other things, to suspend its scientific collaborations with Russia. Until now, however, German scientific Russian ties with Russia have been a significant part of the country's science diplomacy strategy. I was, and I am, of course, very aware of the document that the ministry put out a couple of years ago. And you placed so much importance on the role of science diplomacy. Having this new situation, how do you think that we should think science diplomacy now? Should we redefine the term? What is the strategies that we have to adopt now? The floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Professor Rintezi, dear Dr. Adamson, dear Professor Honegger, and dear participants. Thank you for the invitation to this round table. I'm really very pleased to participate in this discussion about science diplomacy in times of war. Well, I'm not a researcher, I'm a diplomat and a policy advisor. And as you said, since I took on the task of the Director for Research and Academic Relations Policy in the Federal Foreign Office, it was 3 years ago, I've been working intensively on the Federal Foreign Office science diplomacy strategy. And we brought it out in 2020 in December, this strategy, and had many discussions with our partners, for example, with the German Academic Exchange Service and others from the scientific side, but also in the political area. So this was one of the main topics, the main issues of our foreign science policy in the Federal Foreign Office. And now the Russian invasion of Ukraine presents us with a new situation. First of all, let me make it clear that the German government condemns the Russia's military aggression against Ukraine in the really strongest terms. The federal government stands with the Ukrainian government and with the Ukrainian people in their efforts to resist the Russian invasion. The Russian attack on a sovereign democratic country that is part of Europe violates international law and fundamental principles of the Charter of the United Nations. it jeopardizes international peace and security, and thus it is an attack on all of us. That's what we mean, and we must respond to it with firm resolve. Part of German foreign science and research policy is international scientific cooperation, as you know, and the Federal Foreign Office understands science diplomacy as an interface between foreign policy, science, research-based business, and civil society, in which the perspectives, concerns, and interests of these three or four areas, are brought together and cross-linked through international dialogue. And from a foreign policy perspective, our guiding questions are, on the one hand, how can we strengthen our foreign policy potential through scientific advice and international science cooperation? And on the other hand, how can foreign policy promote international scientific cooperation? Science can build bridges with its corporations. That's what we are saying in our science diplomacy strategy. And the great success of Germany as a science nation, a science country, and of German science organization relies on their independence. So it has to be clear that this is not the case in all countries. Liberal democracies are increasingly being questioned by authoritarian powers, as we see at the moment, and we are struggling for values, narratives, and attitudes. As a result, collaborations cannot be taken for granted anymore. Access is becoming more difficult in very many places. Doors for German science and research institutions are no longer open without restrictions everywhere. And against this background, the war in Ukraine represents a shift for German science diplomacy. The geopolitical effects of the war will also shape international science policy for years to come. That's our point of view, I would say. In a competition between systems, we have to make fundamental decisions. The demand for strategic solidarity among democracies could increase. This is one of the changes, I think, we have to talk about when we are thinking about the future of our science diplomacy strategy. The rapid, clear, and coherent reaction of the German government, as you mentioned, Professor Rintezi, and also of the alliance of science organizations as well as EU partners, could be a first example of this change, of this new, let's say, strategic solidarity among democracies in scientific cooperation. The Federal Ministry of Education and Research, part of the federal government in Germany, in coordination with the Federal Foreign Office and the Federal Chancellery, announced a sweeping change of policy in its cooperation with Russia on February the 25th, one day after the beginning of the war. It was very rapid, and I think it was important to do this. Our national and international efforts aim to isolate the Russian government to the greatest possible extent. And all measures that have been implemented or have been planned by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research in cooperation with the government agencies in Russia will be frozen and or subjected to critical review. At the same time, we will keep doors open to researchers from Russia who face political persecution. I think this is very important to make a difference between institutional cooperation and individual, let's say, networking or networks. We will stand by the people with whom we have cooperated for many years. Strengthening civil society is now more important than before, I think, and we want to continue the dialogue with civil society structures in academia and research in Russia to the extent possible. These are, well, the guidelines of the, well, new approach, let's say, of our science diplomacy and of our international scientific cooperation policy within the Federal Foreign Office and the whole federal government of Germany. With these freezing efforts, the federal government aim at isolating the official Russian governmental institutions, not the individual Russians, students or scientists, as I said before. Therefore, we keep doors open to academics from Russia, especially for them who face political persecution. Our intention is to strengthen civil society by continuing the dialogue with civil society structures in academia and research in Russia. And the German Academic Exchange Service, my dear colleague, Dr. Harms, will talk to us later, and also the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation's two very important partners of the Federal Foreign Office in the field of science diplomacy. They, for example, continue to grant scholarships to Russian students, researchers, and alumni. Let me say it's important that we focus not only on Russia, but also on Ukraine. I think this has to be mentioned. Here, both the Federal Ministry of Education and Research and the Federal Foreign Office are in discussion with the German Parliament. We are talking about the budget for for this year and also for the next years, while we are in discussion with the Parliament about the comprehensive proposals for supporting Ukrainian students and scientists in Germany. Well, it is true that Russia has been over decades one of our closest partners regarding scientific cooperation. But the change of policy towards Russia and also towards Belarus is, due to the war of aggression against Ukraine, necessary. In this situation, we can't just do business as usual, let me say. What does that mean for our science diplomacy in the medium and long term? When the Federal Foreign Office developed its strategy in 2020, as I said before, we considered that international cooperation in the field of science and research is more important than ever, not only from a foreign policy perspective, but also this applies to global challenges such as climate change, the fight against hunger and poverty, the fight against conflicts and crisis, of course, or for sustainable development. And in my opinion, I think this is important to say also in these times, in my opinion, that is still the right thing to do in this area. But we must not be naive and need a clear normative compass, let me say. We strive for scientific cooperation worldwide, but not at any price. I think this is important also for the German science diplomacy. Science has also a self-commitment as an expression of its responsibility, which goes hand in hand with its freedom. And this responsibility we have to talk about as part of the society, which is represented by government officials or by the politicians, and on the other side with scientists. We need this discussion about responsibility. Against this background, we are already thinking about the implications of Russia's military aggression against the Ukraine for our general science diplomacy approach. It may be, for example, it's one thesis, that we are witnessing a separation of Russia from large parts of the scientific world. The consequences for Russian science, economy and society are very serious. But globally, I think the steady trend to internationalize science so far could at least be inhibited. For Germany, from my point of view, this could mean more research sovereignty, let me say, with a focus on own interests, less dependencies. Research security could gain in importance, more competition for bright minds, less tolerance for autocracies. I think these are some important questions that German science diplomacy will have to deal with in the near future. I have no answers at the moment, but I think it's important to have this discussion also with experts from the science area, also with experts who are thinking about science diplomacy from a, let me say, scientific point of view, like we have in this round. So I would like to invite you to take part in this discussion about the future of science diplomacy. We will do science diplomacy in part with other instruments, fixed structures with partners considered to be reliable on the one hand, on the other hand, with difficult partners, rather plan for option of freezing or getting out. I think it's important to have this or to be courageous to discuss these questions. Where are our partners which share the same values, like we have, for example, in Germany or in Europe, and where are difficult partners where we need, in special situations, also a plan for getting out a cooperation or for freezing a cooperation. But one thing I think, and that's my last point I would mention, one thing is very important, and it fits to this guideline which I mentioned before, to freeze institutional cooperation, but to go on in individual fostering. We will continue to rely on scholarships. I think this is important because scholarships are an investment into the people, not least because the current situation shows us that personal networks are proving to be more resilient, more flexible, and perhaps also more valuable than institutional cooperation. That's for the moment. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you very much for elaborating the strategy and the position of the Foreign Office. And I'm really glad, and I think we all value what you just said, that this is a courageous discussion and that the Foreign Ministry is open to actually do this discussion and even invite scientists and I hope also people from the humanities. This is at least our perspective here, that you are open to our opinions as well, that might not be always the same as the ministries, for example. So I'm really happy that you open this space for all of us to get in. And let me now turn to our next panelist, Dr. Michael Harms, Deputy Secretary General of the DAD, the German Academic Exchange Service. And let me say, for those who don't know the DAD, for our international audience, that this is one of the most important funding bodies in Germany and also a leading organization concerning higher education in the country. I also have to admit that last week the DAD had a very interesting panel on exactly the same topic in German, inviting German colleagues. Of course, you beat us on the number of participants in your panel. We have much less, which shows how strong your network is. I'm really thankful that you are here today and you join us, because I think the position of the DAD in this German context is really and absolutely very important. As far as I know, the president, the DAD president, was the very first that raised the issue of what science diplomacy means in wartime with an article he wrote maybe a couple of days right after the invasion of the Ukraine from Russians. And right now, the DAD is strongly committed, at least this is what I read in the news, and this is what we also see through our university, is strongly committed to supporting Ukrainian academics and students, open up the German universities. This is what you also suggest to our universities. And also you welcome threatened and persecuted scientists. At the same time, if I'm not wrong, the DAD has suspended funding for the mobility of researchers and students from Germany to Russia, and also suspended all talks with representatives of the Russian state. And I think this is also similar to what we already heard about the institutional ties and the way that we go about them. So I would like you to tell us a little bit more about the DAD strategy and how do we envision from your side what science diplomacy could be in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Friedrich-Alexander-Universität Erlangen-Nürnberg for organizing this important event today. The 24th of February changed everything. It marked a turning point in international history. The German Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, stated on the morning of that day that we woke up in a different world. And I think that's a very true statement. And of course, this means that there are huge repercussions on international cooperation in science and research as well. And in view of the enormous ties between Germany and Russia in the field of science, very fundamental questions have arisen for German universities as well as for non-university research institutions. In fact, Vito Cetera and I, we were in Moscow in 2019 to celebrate what was then a very successful German-Russian year of science. And that's very painful for us because our DAD Moscow office has been in operation for almost 30 years. We have 3 small offices in the countries and several hundreds of partnerships with Russian universities. But there cannot be any business as usual. I totally agree on that with Vito Ceceri from the Foreign Office. Together with our friends of the Alliance of Science Organizations in Germany, we have made it very clear that we are in full solidarity with Ukraine, that nothing can justify the Russian attack. As a result, you've said that already, we have restricted and have frozen our institutional cooperation with Russian universities and research organizations, while we're eager at the same time to maintain links with individual researchers. Now, what does that mean in detail? We have suspended all talks with representatives of the Russian state, such as the ministries for the time being, or official meetings in institutionalized context with state institutions. The same applies to joint German-Russian events within the framework of university cooperation, which are funded by the DAD. These are also suspended. On the other hand, we of course want to continue to support the many Russian scientists and students who are with us or who want to come to us. In other words, we're not restricting the promotion of mobility from Russia to Germany at this point in time. On the contrary, we feel that keeping the channels of communication and exchange platforms open for as long as possible is in our own interest and shows that we do not want to sanction the Russians, but the Russian state. We have also suspended funding for the mobilities of researchers and students from Germany to Russia. That's for various reasons, to prevent financial inflows to Russia, but also for security reasons. And you see, we make a big difference between the institution of the states and individual scientists. Many of our colleagues, our friends at Russian universities and scientific institutions are just as appalled by their government as we are. Many are also publicly critical of the war of aggression against Ukraine and accept considerable risk and repression to express those views. We have very much respect and high regard for the courage of the thousands of Russian scientists who stood up against their government. And I just want to mention here the letter that has been signed by more than 8,000 scientists from Russia. We want to recognize this and strengthen the forces that are critical of the government. That's why we consistently distinguish between the government on the one side and citizens on the other side. And by not allowing our Russian friends to be taken hostage by the Putin government. And we do everything that we can to make sure that Russian students are not discriminated against on German campuses. We join forces there with the German Rectors Conference in a joint press release. However, we are very much aware that the line between the individual and his institution is a very thin one. Sometimes it may be hard to find the right answer in this context. What's more, our universities may interpret our recommendation differently. Some are more hardline than others. But allow me also to talk about Ukraine, because that's very important for us, at least, that we do not focus on Russia alone. Under the umbrella of science diplomacy, we consider it our duty to develop strategies to support the higher education system in the country and to protect threatened and persecuted students and scientists. I'm based in Berlin, and tens of thousands of refugees have fled to the city in the past weeks. If you go to the Hauptbahnhof, the main station here in Berlin, you can see that. In the foreseeable future, as many as 100,000 students, teachers, and researchers may want to enter the German higher education system. We know of aid funds, we know of schemes at our member universities to support these individuals, but we think that is not enough. We think that we are convinced even that we need a federal support program for universities, because a commitment to helping individuals will not be enough. So as a DAD, we think that we need a comprehensive support program that include the pillars that have proven successful in other fragile contexts. And I may want to refer to 2016 and the following years, where we did similar things with people who fled then from Syria and Afghanistan. We think it is important to award scholarships for Ukrainian students, for doctoral candidates and scientists who will come to us in the coming weeks and months, as well as the unbureaucratic extension of funding for those who are already with us. But we also, and that's very important, need to strengthen the support for German universities in supervising and helping Ukrainians through the funding period and beyond. They are doing a wonderful job when it comes to helping Ukrainians on their campuses. They need professional and linguistic further qualifications. They need help when they want to enter the German labor market. And what's very important to us too is to support our member universities in the development and provision of digital offerings for their Ukrainian partner universities, as long as they continue to operate in that way. I am glad to say that only about an hour or so before the conference started today, we went online with the central information website. It's www.ead-ukraine.org, and it is the central platform for all Ukrainian students and researchers who want to come to our country and need information and guidance. We have developed that website, that platform, with not only our member universities, but with many befriended organizations here in Germany and with the help of ministries as well. Now, we have been in touch with the Ukrainian Ministry of Education and Science too, and especially their Young Scientist Council, and they have told us what they need right now. And based on these talks, we have submitted a program that's called Ukraine Digital, and its aim is to ensure study success in times of war. The program is intended to support Ukrainian universities in maintaining a digital study offer. To this end, German universities, together with Ukrainian partners, are to enable the digital continuation of ongoing Ukrainian degree programs, so that students in Ukraine have the prospect of completing their studies despite the restrictions and hardships imposed by the war. And we have been receiving these signals because there's a huge fear of brain drain in the country, and we want to do something, to help in that situation. And I think to, grant something that is continuity is very important to our partners at this very moment. With these words, I would like to leave it. I'm sure there may be questions afterwards, and I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harms. One, for speaking to the perspective of the DAAD, which is, of course, a linchpin science diplomacy and institution devoted to academic and international relations. But also for sharing your more personal sense of what this is like. And I think that speaks to the shocking nature of the Russian invasion and everything that's ensued. I would now like to steer the conversation back to Professor Joachim Honegger, who opened up our event. He's the president of Friedrich-Alexander-Universität here in Erlangen, and he's been the president since 2015. And having him with us provides us an opportunity to ask him a little bit about the university's response to events. In particular, I'd like to note that on the 24th of February, the day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the German Rectors Conference strongly condemned the Russian attack on Ukraine with a short but very clear statement supporting Ukrainian academics and students. The statement also mentioned, and I quote it, the Rectors Conference will explore the possibilities for continuing and shaping university and academic relations with Ukraine and Russia in cooperation with the German academic organizations, in particular with the DAAD, and in consultation with the federal government. For the university, in practice, what has this meant? And how has the university, which has such a strong international profile, reacted to the new conditions of the last 5 weeks?
Thank you, Matthew, for this question, and thanks again for inviting me also to give you a few hints what FAU did within this very difficult situation and what German universities decided to do. Before I go into my answer, I want to express my appreciation of what Dr. Harms said regarding the web page you have launched today. I think it's very important that we have a very central access point to the German academic world for all the students from Ukraine, for all the researchers, but also for professors who are now with us in Germany and who try to maintain their academic life and the academic collaboration with partners, but also the academic education of the students. This is a very difficult situation. And we are also very happy that the German Rectors Conference and DAD right away after the invasion gave a lot of recommendations for German universities how to behave in the situation. And as Dr. Harms said, the universities reacted quite differently regarding how to deal with Russian students, how to deal with Ukrainian students and researchers. So what does it mean for us from FAU's point of view? After the invasion, 2 days later, we announced as FAU that our doors are open for Ukrainian students who want to study or continue their studies at FAU, with knowing that there are many difficulties also regarding study fields like medicine, where we have a limited amount of places at our universities or slots for students, where we have a clear problem that we can bring in all the students. We opened our doors and we have a lot of Ukrainian students who try to join FAU and actually who joined us. We also have students from Ukraine and Russia already in the system, and we also took care of them. We approached them, we contacted them, we talked to them and listened to their needs and the type of support we can give as a university. And this is something that is really difficult also for us, in particular if we look at our Russian students. And it's already mentioned that, of course, we have to look at the individuals. Are they in risk of political prosecution if we don't support them and if they have to go back to Russia? And we have to understand what their individual needs are, having in mind that we have the sanctions of the European Union and the Federal Republic of Germany. And if they cannot have access to their funding from Russia, we can, of course, not easily compensate for their reduction of income and for their financial problems. So this is something that we really have to deal with. And the relationship to Ukrainian universities, it's clear for us because we also condemn the Russian invasion and we support, of course, Ukrainian students and Ukrainian researchers. And we, as FAU, we approached also rectors from Ukrainian universities and talked to them. They have had video conferences with us and we explained to them what our offerings are and how we can support. And we also try to understand what are their actual needs. And particularly with one selected university in the Ukraine, we have made that many of their students are now with FAU, and we will have set up a very special agreement without talking about the details here. Russia, that's way more complicated. I mean, you know, academia is very open-minded. The academic world is open. We don't look at borders. We collaborate because we have friends everywhere, and we also have friends in Russia. I mean, I personally have a lot of colleagues in my field. We cooperated in the past, and we have a personal relationship. And for me, it's also very difficult. I mean, how to deal with this type of situation? Should I send them email? Should I approach them, knowing that the rector of their university has signed a document supporting Putin's politics? Yeah, actually, I haven't I haven't sent a single email to one of the colleagues in one of these universities because I'm some kind of not sure how to deal with this situation. That's very difficult, and that makes me personally very emotional because I know them very well. I met with them. We had dinner. We worked together. We had fun together. They visited us here in Erlangen at our university. We visited them. We had a students exchange program, and now all this is cut off because we have this very difficult type of situation. What else did we do? We started a crowdfunding at our university, FAU for Ukraine, where we encourage students, researchers, but also the people here in the metropolitan region to donate to support Ukrainian students and researchers at our university. And we have one colleague who is already retired, and he has a very strong link to Ukraine and who is managing all this for us, how to distribute the money, what are the scholarships that we can give, what are the criteria based on them, which we use to distribute the money. We also have, of course, Ukrainian students who have the problem that they don't know what's going to be their future, how they can deal with the situation in their home country, how they can keep up the link with their home country, how they can discuss things very openly. We also have installed at our university one room where they can meet and they can be sure that nobody will have a chance to know what they actually talk about. So this is also something that we can guarantee from our side. And we also set up with our students who are very supportive, transportation of supplies for the daily life. Right the first day the war started, we organized this. We sent trucks to the border of the Ukraine and support the Ukrainian people in this difficult situation they are currently in. The discrimination of Russian students is something that the board of FAU has clearly here considered as an issue, and we are really supporting the students from Russia at our university a lot and want to make sure that they are not discriminated if they have made clear that they do not support Putin's politics, and they also condemn the invasion of Ukraine. So we have discussions on various levels. I have professors with a Ukrainian-Russian background who are at our university and are supporting also the demonstrations against the war. I have colleagues from Russia who talk to us and say, can I attend the demonstration as a Russian citizen because I'm also against the war? And we can say, of course, in Germany, you can come up with your opinion in public and you can tell people what you think about certain developments. That's the right of free speech here at our university, but also in our country, and we give full support. So to summarize, FAU did a lot. We look at individuals. We, of course, use the guidelines of DAAD and the German Rectors Conference for our decisions. Of course, we have the EU and the German sanctions in mind, and we try to be as consistent as possible with that because that's the government decision that we have to support as a public university, of course. And we are also committed to an open academic exchange worldwide without borders. And the situation of war brought us all in a situation that we have never, ever expected. And that is very demanding to everybody in the German university system who signs responsible for decisions at his or her university. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Honegger, and thank you especially for providing us this perspective of the university. I think in the public news, very often we're hearing a lot about policy at national level, but when we think about key institutions, universities are crucial in science diplomacy and in the international relations at the academic level. And so I think the perspective is particularly important to be voiced here. I would now like to turn to Professor Claudio Feio. It's a privilege to introduce him. He's a professor at the Technical University of Madrid, where he serves as Director for Entrepreneurship, leading programs on tech-based startups and spin-offs. Given, Professor, that you've worked for the European Commission and you've lived in China for several years, and you're currently teaching geopolitics of technology at the Diplomatic School of Spain, you have a very personal and a very extensive knowledge of China's academic system and policy. So we'll pivot a little bit here to the Asian perspective on current events, especially the Chinese perspective. With that in mind, we would like to ask you if you can elaborate China's position at present in terms of academic institutions and science diplomacy.
So thanks, first of all, thanks for the invite, and also good evening, good local time, wherever you are. Yeah, this is a little bit my experience living in China and also working directly with the best universities in technology there. So also I keep engaged with them. So I have a little bit of almost a real time idea of what is happening. So we are shifting a little bit to China. Also because everybody knows that one of the few countries can stop the war in Ukraine is China. No? So this is important. However, not in general, not very positive. No, in fact, using the words of the European Commission High Representative, no, Vice President Josep Borrell. By the way, he's a graduate from our university. He's an aerospace engineer. He says there was a summit past week or this week even. They say China they did not want to talk about Ukraine. This is so. I'm going simply to make 6 observations based on my experience. The first observation is the fundamentals, the principles, the idea that China has stays is not changing because of any of this. You need to think that under China view, planned economy, authoritarian regime, everything is a tool to achieve their status as the best country, best society in the world. So they are still thinking in this virtuous circle of technology, from technology into innovation, then some competitive advantage, and then productivity, and this will take them to leadership. So of course, universities, science, diplomacy, they do play a role in this virtuous circle, but also they are part of the tools. So in that sense, we can say it's a little bit of a China's self-interest. That doesn't mean that we, especially maybe in the past, we didn't have our own selfish interests, but this is what is happening. This is observation number 1. And together with this, number 2 is also the difficulties to achieve this status in China stay. So they are mostly internal. They are not so much influenced by external effects, like even the war in Ukraine. So it means demographics, pollution, inequalities. But I will focus on the connection with universities and science diplomacy. You know, that is this part on the transformation of the economy, because they want to escape this middle income trap and at some point become a high income country. So this is again related with innovation. This is again related with the transformation in the industry. And here there's an important observation. It's not a matter of investment. It is a matter of having enough capacity to absorb this investment in the industry. This is why the government and also universities and new tech companies, they have shifted into deep tech. This is what they think can transform the country and send it in this new road. No? So this is also why they have this they call it double circulation model, where they, let's say, protect their internal market at the same time they still keep connections. In terms of universities, this means basically they think cooperation and connections should be the same. Why changing? Because they still think they need this connection to improve the situation. So cooperation in technology from the China side is still open. They think, why changing? No, this is the main message. Observation number 3 is, having said this, still the predominant view from universities in Ukraine is they think is part of what they think is the decline of the West. So from a China perspective, you think Brexit and Trump and I don't know, management, lousy management of COVID, and then comes Russian war and elections in Hungary. I don't know, you name it. Huh? It's difficult for them to see. This has their own dynamics. It's difficult to escape from these dynamics. So better stay away. Not these dynamics drag us as Chinese into something that we don't want to be too much involved. So then this is a reality. Most of the pieces you see these days in academic institutions in China go along this way. However, number 4, for the first time in years, there seem to be little cracks in a system that tries to keep everybody in the middle, no? Everything very harmonious. So there's some dissent. Huh? So there are, for instance, some papers critical with the indirect support to Russia, and they stay longer in the Chinese internet than traditional censorship will have allowed to. So I think you can sense it's a little bit of a forced majoritarian support to Russia and blaming to NATO and the US, and also trying to say that basically Europe will follow Washington ideas. But if you listen, there's also some support to Ukraine. In fact, officially, they are staying in a very uncomfortable middle ground, and this also you can feel at the university level. No? So, and I will say also, there's some degree of surprise in China how Europe has reacted and has reacted, especially supporting of our values. I think they didn't expect that, no? And in a way we can say there's a little bit of a I don't know, difference between something we can call political China and technocratic China, and this is not completely aligned, and maybe this is also something important for us to have in mind. And number 5, this takes me to something that I will say is the elephant in the room, that is the comparison with Taiwan. This is in the background in China. Conventional wisdom, I was talking with people lately in MERICS and in some other think tanks in Europe, say that this will delay any plans for reunification that might exist in China. But the interesting thing here is no one is mentioning this in China. So my understanding is this is important. When someone in China doesn't mention some important matter at all, it means this is the key thing. No? Okay. So and then number 6, and maybe it connects back to your question and where we are discussing. There's a very good document from a university professor, a Chinese scholar called Xi Chan, and this paper, very recent, like maybe 2 weeks or just 1 week ago, says, I don't know what is going to happen with Ukraine, but this is the first war in the metaverse. And I think this is a very important observation because this is both an online and an offline war. And this is something maybe we haven't reflected so much from the perspective of science. And sometimes I talk about technology diplomacy. It means it is fighting individually, but in social media, with images and also gamification, maybe even. It is going to be, and this is very important, it's going to be a war on values. It's going to be a war on narratives. I think Mr. Cecere was saying this in a way, I think. At least I noticed something related with it, maybe interesting area for discussion. And we should be prepared. And the focus, I think, should be here. So his conclusion in this paper is a little bit my conclusion. So online experience can change the boundaries of behavior. And also the online world will redefine the offline world. And this is also true for scientific diplomacy and something that we should be aware of. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Feijó. Thank you, Claudio. I think you bring to us a perspective that is not very clear or very prominent in our discussions, right? It's important to see this as the decline of the West in general, instead of seeing this as a conflict between two nations. It's a totally different perspective, I think, to the discussion we're having today. So many thanks, and I think this is going to be important for our discussion later. Let me now turn to Professor Baltas and allow me to call him Aristides, because I had the privilege to be his student when I was in Greece. Aristides is a professor of philosophy of science. He's emeritus professor at the National Technical University of Athens. And the reason I thought that his input is going to be key for our discussion is not because he was my professor and I have a very nice and personal relation to him, but because of his disciplinary background. Aristides, for those who don't know you, you have been a professor, as I said, in philosophy of science. I'm sorry, but I come out of 2 weeks of COVID and my voice is still not perfect. So I'm really sorry for this. And when I talk too much, then it comes up. So I was saying that Aristides is a philosopher of science. He is among the ones, the very few ones that set up the program for history and philosophy of science in Greece. He is a prominent philosopher in our country, in my country, and he has a very nice academic and important academic career. At the same time, Aristides had a very interesting political career, and political in the sense of being at the central politics of the country. He became a Minister of Education in 2015 in the cabinet of Alexis Tsipras, and then in the following election, he also became Minister of Culture and Sports in the country. So my question, Aristides, is having all this very interesting political and academic experience, how do you analyze the events that we are going through right now? So I really looking forward to hear your perspective. Aristides, you are muted.
Yes. Thank you very much, first of all. This is a very flattering invitation, for your flattering words as well, but also flattering because the issue is very difficult, and being invited to talk about a very difficult issue in such a setting is really something important, even for me personally. The issue is difficult because you have to think a little bit towards the past in order to understand what I mean by difficult. Going towards the past, let's isolate, so to speak, the moment when Europe became unified at the level of ideas, at least, which is the 17th century. 17th century meant, as you well know, all kinds of conflicts, religious conflicts, very bitter, 30-year war, dynasties fighting each other, all that sort of thing. But at the same time, there were scientists, the beginnings of modern science, what we call the scientific revolution, who were dispersed in different cities of Europe, and who managed to talk to each other continuously, independently of religious allegiances, nationalities, languages, traditions, and so forth. Without this unification, Copernicus in Prague, Kepler in Graz, and wherever, Galileo in Florence, Descartes moving because he was exiled from France or looked after in France to Stockholm and before to Amsterdam. I mean, Huygens in Amsterdam. All these people managed to talk to each other and develop ideas independently of where they were coming from and of what their other allegiances were. At the same time, almost, the Enlightenment is again the idea that ideas have their own force. You can discuss ideas, criticize ideas independently of other kinds of obligations, allegiances, traditions, and so forth. And I think this is the lasting contribution of Europe as a whole to the world, practically. And it's interesting to see how people managed to do all this, travel around Europe. There were two people who were important for this kind of travel. One was Per Mersenne, a French mathematician. The other was Heinrich Oldenburg, a German who was secretary of the Royal Society in England, who managed to bring in contact all these thinkers one with the other, and so promote the new idea of science and the new idea of enlightenment as well. This tradition did not continue up to the beginnings of the 20th century, as a matter of fact, because during the First War, you remember, during the First War, before the First War, there was a big discussion whether there should be a war, first of all, because the idea was that big powers at the time were just trying to expand their empires, take over countries, having new, let's say, colonies and all that sort of thing. And so there was a big movement against the war throughout Europe as well. And even when the war erupted, Russell in London, who had been imprisoned because he was against the war, could discuss with Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was eager to go to war for his own personal reasons, across the war. So you have this tradition, and having this tradition and being involved with science, not just the hard sciences, but also history, sociology, of course, and all that, you have to think twice before proceeding to measures of the kind we have been in Europe proceeding to after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I mean two things, and I come to my second, as it were, dimension, as Maria explained. We all are denouncing, of course, and we are doing very well, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Nobody in Greece thought otherwise at the time. Even, I mean, people who believed in Russia for various reasons did not hesitate in denouncing the invasion, supporting the Ukraine from this invasion, admitting refugees. You know, Greece has a tradition of refugees and hospitality. And so there was no issue about that. But then if you look historically at the thing, you start seeing that you need an explanation. And the explanation cannot be at an ethical level, how good or bad guy is Putin. He's a bad guy, but that's another question. You have to try to figure out why invasion of Ukraine at this moment, what had happened before, why this was not avoided through diplomacy, of course, before the war and all that sort of thing. I'm not entering into it because it's too complicated, it's too political, so to speak, also, etc. But I'm taking out of this idea that from my experience in the Ministry of Culture mainly, what I used to say to myself and to my colleagues there was that culture is soft diplomacy. Being a minister of culture, you are, in a sense, a minister of foreign affairs of a lower rank and a much easier work to do. Why? Because civilizations and cultures don't have anything to fight about. They can share their views, their worldviews, their ideas, their customs, their feelings, the way they behave towards the world and art. And this brings the people together. The peoples of a different world, brings them, culture brings them together. And science, as I was saying before, was the first big cultural issue that brought the people of Europe together eventually, not immediately. Taking this into account, we go to a further step, and I say, visiting different countries at a time, China, for example, or Russia a couple of times, or Korea for that matter. The idea is that once you say, I am a representative of Greece, not at the level of main political, let's say, attitude or line, but I'm a representative of Greece in order to discuss your culture in respect to my culture. And when this became clear, all the other differences started to appear as secondary and could disappear. This is an experience. Given this experience and what I said before, I'm not sure that it's a good policy to withdraw from the international organizations in face of Russia, to expel Russia from international organizations. And I'm saying this as an additional point to what you already said, and which, of course, I completely agree. Help individual scientists, both of Russia and of Ukraine, who come and need our help, of course, absolutely. Make programs for their help and make them feel at home, so to speak, as much as they can in our countries, absolutely. But I go a step further. Why not, for example, if you have a Russian organization or an international organization of which Russia is a member, you say, we don't expel you, but you have to hear, if you want to remain a member of this international organization, what we have to say about the war. And you have to publish our initial statement of what we say about this war, and nevertheless, we continue our cooperation after doing this. If, let's say, the policy was something like that, I'm not proposing a policy, of course, just vague ideas at the moment, but if the policy was like that, it would be much more efficacious, even in respect to the war. Because think, how is this war going to end? What's the NATO policy towards the end of this war? What's the United States policy towards the end of this war? What if this war continues a long time? What will happen to Europe? Will Europe continue to be united, or all kinds of divisions which have already appeared will explode? So all these issues are connected. And discussions like this are quite important because we cannot, of course, solve these problems, but we can open up the discussion to enumerate the factors involved, the kinds of studies we have to do and discussions we have to do along each one of these axes, and then come up with a more, let's say, full-blown idea of how to behave diplomatically in a crisis, in a war crisis, in a way that will help peace. Because the question of having sanctions against Russia, well done, I agree, is not to exterminate Russia, but to stop the war and regain peace. So if the main aim is to regain peace, you have to have a policy which takes all these sometimes contradictory measures into a general plan aiming towards peace. And the last point in regard to China, because I had the experience, I've been once to China, only once, but I had quite a lot of relations with the ambassador of China in Greece at the time, because this was a year of China-Greece cultural common cultural year. He had a saying, it goes very well with what you explained before. He had a say, well, you say the foreign policy of China, take it as a bicycle with two wheels. The first wheel is culture, the second is economics. And we want to discuss things with you Greeks because we have as old civilizations, both of us, and we want to understand Europe, but we thought the better way to understand Europe is to understand Greece. This was flattery, of course, in a sense, but this gave you a feeling of how the Chinese think in respect to Europe. They consider themselves as on the rise. They see the decline of the West. It was not directly spoken like that, of course, for politeness reasons, but it was in there. and they have a very different concept of time. They can wait for years and years and decades. So with this, let's see that there are too many dimensions in all these issues. And I'm really happy to be able to discuss some of them with you tonight.
Thank you, Aristide. Thank you for this very, very interesting and different perspective in a way. Thank you for opening up also issues that we haven't put on the table yet. And this means what is going to happen if the war, when the war ends. And also, I really love this metaphor about foreign policy. We have discussed this earlier, and I think this says a lot. And maybe those of us who work on science diplomacy can use this metaphor, the bicycle, let's say, metaphor. I love this. So now let me turn to Professor Kate Brown. Kate is a dear colleague and expert in Cold War and environmental history. She's a distinguished professor in history of science at the MIT, and she's the one that taught us a lot about Chernobyl. Actually, personally, whatever I know about Chernobyl historically is through Kate's work, which has been really very important and has been recognized throughout the US and outside of the US. So Kate wrote an article recently in the Washington Post where she described a novel problem in Ukraine. And this has to do with nuclear power and the fact that right now there are 15 nuclear power plants that are in operation. And of course, this includes also the remains of the Chernobyl plant. And this article made me think that Kate is going to be one of the best panelists for this discussion, because she brings this perspective about the role of nuclear power in this conflict right now. And you also, Kate, focused on the fact that the nuclear power plants, of course, are not built for war. So my question is to you is based on this disciplinary knowledge that you have, your experience on studying the Chernobyl, whether this can tell us anything about what is happening now and how this can help us understand the situation. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria. And I guess the first message is that in a time of war, diplomacy is carried out less by diplomats and more by soldiers and guns. And so let's look at the sort of architecture of this war. On the very first day of the war, February 24th, the Russian forces made a beeline for right from Belarus then they took the Chernobyl station inside the Chernobyl zone. It was the least guarded, it was the most direct path to Kiev, so it was strategically important. But when they got there, there was a guard with weapons, but they stood down because they understood that this was a vulnerable site. And if there were bullets or missiles flying, that could cause a lot of damage. It would harm everyone. So, we have a lot of historic firsts. So, that the shift supervisor called his boss in the town of Slavutic nearby, and he said, there's no protocol for what to do at a nuclear power plant when it's being attacked by an invader. And that's kind of an amazing insight for us to learn right now, that all the decades of nuclear power and all the disaster scenarios that were dreamed up and placed and tests that were run for power reactors, no one thought to design a manual for one of the most inevitable and human of events, which is war. And so we see this over and over again. The shift crew that was on, they had to stay on the job for 3 weeks. They had no change of clothes, no proper food, no proper beds, no real contact with their family members. And they were supervised by, everywhere they went, they were followed by Russian soldiers. And they had the people that they had to take orders from were Russian officers who may or may not have known much about nuclear power and certainly knew very little about that installation. When the power got cut off to the Chernobyl plant a couple of weeks ago, we all sort of sat nervously wondering, what does that mean? There are basins there of radioactive fuel. There's 2,000 radioactive fuel rods in those basins, and they need to be kept cool. Otherwise, they can self-heat and cause a fire, and that would be a radioactive fire. a week into the war, the Russian forces took the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. This is another historic first. We have never had gun battle, missiles being fired at a nuclear power plant. There was a fire. Fortunately, the fire was in an administrative building. But afterwards, the Ukrainians showed photographs of a missile. The Russians are using older missiles left over from the Cold War. And this missile, fortunately, did not go off because it was launched and landed in an electric transformer at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And had that missile gone off, that would have caused a huge calamity, possibly a fire, but also it would have cut off electricity to that plant. And that plant too has basins filled with nuclear waste, and it also has to have electricity to keep the nuclear power plants that were running. There were a couple of reactors that were still going. They need electricity to function. They need electricity for the plant operators to know what the levels of radiation are and how everything's going. So we had this really dicey and near miss situation in Zaporizhzhia, and we still don't, I still don't feel very secure about what's happening there. The workers there are they're allowed to change shifts, but a lot of workers have tried to flee, so they're understaffed. And everywhere they're working in sort of a hostage situation. Everything they do, they're being monitored by the Russian officers who are hostile to them. So this is our new nuclear reality. And I went through the International Atomic Energy Agency manuals, and I went through the manuals for the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, and I could find no stress tests of containment structures for, there's tests for tornadoes hitting them, for a plane dropping from the sky, but nothing for a missile, an army attacking. The basins, that all the nuclear waste installations are not protected with containment structures. So they're sort of there to be in the way of any kind of missiles or weapons that hit them. And those are very vulnerable installations. So we're living certainly in a new kind of warfare. This is the first real large-scale war in a nuclearized country. 54% of Ukraine's power, as they sought energy sovereignty from Russia, has been comes from nuclear reactors, and we see this. In terms of diplomacy, we see these strange scenarios where the International Atomic Energy Agency makes one statement that says, for instance, power has been cut off to the Chernobyl plant, but don't worry about it because those fuel rods are so old, it would be no problem for them to go uncooled for quite some time. Where meanwhile, my informants who are sitting there who work at that plant are saying, well, you're saying that from Vienna, but try being right here next to the plant and speak that with the same kind of confidence. And then the Ukrainian power companies are saying having sort of opposite concerns. Statements from the IAEA, they're much more worried about what's happening clearly. So these are the kinds of things that are happening. Important thing to note is that Russia has a privileged role in the International Atomic Energy Agency structure. They still sit on the board of governors. So statements that come from the International Atomic Energy Agency have been vetted by these Russian scientific diplomats. I found that as I worked through the Chernobyl records, and I worked in as much as I could in the IAEA archives, as well as the World Health Organization archives. They were much more forthcoming with documents, that the IAEA was less than forthcoming about the aftermath of the Chernobyl, the effects to human health and to environmental degradation. The IAEA basically worked to minimize the statement of effects. So I found them, taking scientific evidence, not believing that, for instance, there was a big epidemic of children with thyroid cancer in Ukraine, and taking that evidence in the form of biopsies, and basically they checked out, but then never burying that evidence. I found them slandering scientists who spoke up to say that there was a public health problem. I find them trying to terminate those scientists, sort of throwing out about half the evidence they got about Chernobyl health consequences. Most of that evidence came directly from the field, from Belarusian and Ukrainian scientists. So, I mean, this is the kind of legacy we have. And I think this legacy of minimizing and even instrumentalizing the Chernobyl accident, just say, look, world's worst nuclear accident, and only 35 people died. We can deal with those kinds of risks, have led us to minimize these kinds of installations and war that's going on, and to overlook this really obvious problem that's right in front of our faces. So that these rumors we heard from unverified reports, we heard of soldiers, Russian soldiers who've been at the Chernobyl plant now in the zone for about a month, that they were getting sick with signs of radiation poisoning, and that one died in a hospital in Belarus, to me are very telling. They tell me that people believe the propaganda that says that only 35 people died from the Chernobyl zone, that the Chernobyl zone nature is thriving. And apparently these soldiers got this kind of dose because they were camping out in the Red Forest. That's a crazy thing to do. But I think it's a result of the kinds of diplomacies we've seen, these battles over science that the nuclear industry has largely won when it comes to the health effects of radiation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brown, and thank you especially for reminding us that the terrible novelty of this situation is at the same time many things. It's political, it's social, it's military and strategic, and it's also very much techno-scientific, right? And that's also an area of historical study that undergirds what we're seeing today, in which your own contribution adds depth to in terms of understanding what's happening in Ukraine. I'd like to turn now for our final prepared question of this evening to Dr. Susan Buck-Morss, Professor Emeritus at Cornell University's Department of Government and a Distinguished Professor of Political Philosophy at the City University of New York Graduate Center. It's very much a privilege to have her with us. She's a core faculty member of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change, and the question we pose for her is meant to get a little at the larger social and political implications of what we're currently seeing, what we're currently witnessing. Professor Buck-Morss, 20 years ago in your book, Dream World and Catastrophe, you foresaw some of the issues we're facing today. As you argued then, the dream, I quote, "The dream of the 20th century was the construction of mass utopia. As the century closes, this dream is being left behind. The larger social vision has given way to private dreams of material happiness and to political cynicism." Since then, you've worked closely with a group of Moscow philosophers and artists over the past 2 decades. Have we now arrived at the final bitter end of the 20th century dream of mass utopia? If so, or if not, is there still a vital, a positive role for science to play in political, diplomatic, and for that matter, cultural and social relations?
Thank you so much, Matthew, for that introduction, but also thank you for this panel. The quality of 10 minutes of talk has been really quite exceptional, and it reminds you of the excellent work being done by multiple experts who understand the complexities, but still act right, make policy, advise on a scientific level. And that's really very heartening and very wonderful to see. And I want to make one comment. I'm hearing you all in English. I doubt any of you, except Kate, perhaps have English as your first language. And I'm sure everyone here has more than English as languages in which they work and colleagues they have. So I am in a grateful position. The last time I had that advantage with English was when Hong Kong was being nervous about being told, it was going to have to be part of the mainland in some limited way. And Beijing intellectuals came down to Hong Kong to speak to Cantonese and Taiwanese intellectuals. And the Cantonese, of course, could not speak to the Beijing. They could have written to each other letters, but they could not speak to each other. So they used English. And I was able to hear, of course, this very, very fascinating discussion. A lot of things I would have said have fortunately already been said because our time is brief. I want to say that having collaborated with Moscow professors from the period at the Academy of Sciences from the period of 1988 until 1993, during that transition period, I'm very aware of the fact that we do belong to a republic of letters. It's what Aristides spoke about with the one wonderful contribution of European dominance. And I think it's still a wonderful contribution. We can't give up on that, practice, which is that we cannot get at the truth, whether it's a scientific truth about nuclear power or a truth about wars or their dangers, or who, it's not so important to make good guys and bad guys as to keep committing ourselves to the truth insofar as we see it. And part of that truth is to recognize our ignorance or our inability to predict the future. We cannot. After my collaboration with Moscow, I was involved via the Brazilian Ministry of Culture with a dialogue of civilizations, you could say, that was funded by Dilma for the purpose of making contact with non-European powers. So I'm speaking now about BRICS. And BRICS is very interesting in this at this moment, because all of the BRICS countries, including Brazil, whether it's Bolsonaro's Brazil or an Black African president of South Africa, or India, or China, all of those countries have refused to condemn Russia. That's important. It's important because they rely, of course, on the economic exports of Russia, and they will rely on it more. And one doesn't want this somehow to be understood, or even not just understood in a misperception, but perhaps even in a truthful perception, as whites against whites, European civilization against European civilization. Look, Putin is no cosmopolitan, not at all. But he has on his side now people from the global south, which were not helped in the Syrian war, and Yemen is still a huge problem. And of course, we don't speak yet about Ethiopia. So that has to keep us aware of the fact that we are in a period of enormous transformation. I think it's totally important to remain true to the values that we have, even though our governments don't always live up to them. Still, they're important. And I, for one, would die for it, because as an intellectual, if I don't have that freedom to speak and write what I see as true, my life really doesn't have a meaning. So I wouldn't be a relativist about this at all, but I also wouldn't be a pessimist. And I think the question sort of presumed I might be, because I think really from my students, particularly now in New York City, they're from all over. I have a seminar right now with a woman from Ukraine and people from South America and people from all over. There is something else going on in this metaverse of the new generation, something that's really very hopeful. So as the crumbling of an old system does occur, and I wouldn't define that as the decline of the West, but certainly the crumbling of an old system, the fact that we rely on every level for the institutions that are thereby threatened, means that we have to be very flexible, we have to be very aware of what's falling, what might rise, and also very optimistic for that possibility. So, you know, I collaborated with Russians, I traveled around to the BRICS countries. My dissertation was written with DAAD funding, and it was about Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno, refugees from war, who are now recognized in the International Republic of Letters as extremely important contributors. And they were saved by the kinds of efforts that policies now are being put in place wonderfully in many countries, but I'm hearing about it with great pride in Germany. And I just have already talked over time. I had a few more things to say, but it doesn't matter. The point is that we're talking about this, and for me, it's been a wonderful conversation. I thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so very much, Professor Buck-Morss, and especially for, I mean, I don't know about the other panelists and guests here, but I certainly feel lots of pessimism, and I'm heartened to hear someone at least speak to the possibility of thinking otherwise at times too about what's happening right now. Before we go any further, I want to make a brief note. We know that Mr. Vito Ceccheri needs to soon depart, and since you have to leave, we want to make sure that we thank you for joining us, and we very much appreciate how you've really opened up the discussion, and we wish you all the best in your next engagement.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me in this conversation. It was so interesting, serious, and yes, inspiring. I think there is so much input to take away for us in the political practice, and I hope to see you again. Let's keep in touch, please, and let's continue this discussion about this very, very important issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you once again. The discussion has taken quite a bit of time, and I realize we're running short of time. We have a moment for a couple of questions. We've received many questions. I'm afraid we won't be able to ask them all to our panelists. We appreciate the questions that have come in, but we've got no choice but to select only a couple because of our limited time. And to spare Maria's sore throat, I think I'll ask the questions for now. And the first question comes from Pierre Bruno Ruffini, a scholar of science diplomacy and a member of the InsSciDE project. And Pierre Bruno asks the following. This is a question that's aimed first and foremost at German officials who are with us today. Under what conditions would you decide to cancel the freezing of your institutional relations with Russia?
Could you repeat the question, please? Under what conditions can we?
Sure, I'll repeat it. Forgive me. Under what conditions would you decide to cancel the freezing of your institutional relations with Russian institutions?
Well, I'm certainly not a German official, you know, and I cannot speak for certainly not for the Foreign Office. But I think that's a very, very good question, and I don't know the perfect answer to it. But as soon as possible. I mean, the thing is, for us, you know, it's elaborated, I think, the stance we took right away, and it was extremely difficult. I mean, just to give you an idea, we were present in Egypt in the 60s when there were no diplomatic relations between Germany and Egypt at the time, and we could operate, and we did our work, and we thought it was the right work. And we were present in North Korea for a very long time. We did international cooperation with Cuba when nobody else did, and so on and so forth. So what I was trying to say is that we didn't do that kind of, it wasn't easy for us to do that, right? But we still think it's right. And I think the question is a very good one, actually, and I'm very grateful for that. And my answer would be as soon as possible. The thing is, our office is still open, okay? We haven't closed down our Moscow office, and we will not. I mean, if the Russian authorities allow that we keep our business going, then we will, and we would try to work together with our Russian institutions and our friends in the institutions as soon as possible after the war will have ended, hopefully.
I also would like to comment on this very difficult question. I mean, we froze our relationship 2 days after the war started without any official requirement from the government of Bavaria, because we said this aggression of Russia has to be condemned. And in this situation, we said we want to freeze the official relationship, except that we have, always the individual component, that we look at individual people. And if we look at individual people, it's always important for us to know that these people are not agreeing with Putin's decision to attack Ukraine. We do not want to have an interaction with people supporting Putin's politics. And given the institutional freezing, I mean, for us, it's important that the whole institution condemns Putin's politics. Otherwise, there is no option for us to discuss anything, given the current situation. And even if that is given, of course, we have to look into the details and look how much or on which basis this collaboration should be set up. Here in Erlangen, we also have a very special situation because we have a city partnership with one Russian city called Vladimir. And our city council decided to maintain this relationship and they decided not to freeze the relationship to Vladimir. That was a very intense discussion. And one of the key arguments was that the city of Vladimir and all the people we interact with are not happy and condemn the aggressive way Putin attacks Ukraine. And we also said, as the city of Erlangen, and I cannot talk for the city of Erlangen, but that's an example where they have decided to go a different way and to maintain the relationship. We have to keep up with the discussion with our friends over there, even in very hard and tough times. As an university, I think it will take some time that we can come up with a intense close collaboration with Russian universities as we had it before the war has started. And my gut feeling is that we will have a very, very long time ahead of us until these relationships will come up on a level that it used to be.
Thank you both for your responses to this question. We didn't really mean to put you on the spot with the question, and we very much appreciate the variety of answers that you've given. Let me turn to another question. This is from Veronika Sigutova, and this is in regards to Professor Fejo's notion, his statement about, quote, war in the metaverse. It's a very interesting idea. And her question is this: what roles, what duties does science diplomacy have in mediating the virtual war? That is, dealing with misinformation, information manipulation, and so on. And I think it's only fair to let Professor Feio have first attempt at answering the question, but I would also like to invite all the other panelists who would like to answer the question. Professor Feio.
Yeah, and thanks for the question. And I will be very brief to leave room for others, especially Professor Backmores, because I'm going to use a little bit of her ideas on this. That is, the war in the metaverse is about values, and I think this is the guiding light. So probably we will confront narratives. No, this is the hot topic these days, and it's for example, as the Chinese like to put it, this is cultures confronting. They don't say the word culture. They use the word civilization because they think that this is something bigger. So it's about this. So sticking to our values and knowing which our values, it will be the guiding light. But maybe Susan, you have more insights into this.
Let me say briefly to that, when I say values, I don't mean values of civilization. I mean, BRICS has nothing in common. These countries have nothing in common except the claim to have a unique civilization that has to be defended or whatever, or, is going to go up, as if the people in the country are not as important as the civilization, right? And but that can be actually pierced by the function of the metaverse, because you see constellations of voices coming together that are not speaking for a nation or a government or a civilization, but they are speaking for values, and these values are more broadly shared. I would claim, thinking now of my Hong Kong students, whom I didn't mention the first round. More broadly shared, particularly among the younger generation, than we give credit, perhaps. I don't think that the younger generation sees their value as something that is limited to a civilization or a country or a culture or a language. And I do think that a certain kind of democracy, or I don't even think we have to defend Western democracy, because I'm not sure quite what that means, particularly as someone who bears the responsibility for United States foreign policy during the 20th century. But I do think that we share, as intellectuals, as members of the Republic of Letters, we share certain values. And we share them with the sense, and I'm talking now with Dr. Honegger's comments about his friends, whether he should email his friends in Moscow. I am feeling, or in Russia generally, I am feeling so much the same feelings, because the fact that I can't reach out without perhaps jeopardizing their situation makes me wonder on this level, will it work to say you can come and study in our country, but you have to be against the official policy of your own country? That to me is unfortunate if those are our only two choices. I wish there was some sort of fantasy institution called the Republic of Letters that would have its own values and its own way of collaborating with national institutions across this problematic boundary.
Thank you, Susan. Let me just, I think, because I'm afraid that we exhausted the panelists and the audience as well, but I just want to bring one personal note here, following up on what Professor Honegger was saying before, and Susan. I did a great mistake, because I was thinking I want in this panel two more participants, one Russian and one Ukrainian. So I wrote to a Russian friend that I had, very close collaboration I have with him. And I said, and that was when I started thinking and designing this panel, maybe it was the very first week of the war. And I say, are you interested in joining us? And the guy responded immediately and he said, I'd love to, but I cannot. That's it. Nothing more, right? No explanation why not. And this is a lot. And I think this is why I have a special interest, not only supporting the Ukrainians, but I think the International Science Council goes one step further. And they, as I said in the beginning of our meeting today, they circulated a letter yesterday, and the letter doesn't mention Ukrainians, Russians. It doesn't mention any nationality. They only say that we want to support scientists in exile, and we want to support the scientists that are under threat. And I think this is the message that we should live and close. And this is the way I think we should close the meeting today, that one of the science diplomacy aims should be at this point to support the people that are suffering right now from this conflict. And this is not the only conflict. And I really appreciate the fact, and I think that it was Dr. Harms that mentioned this earlier in the discussion about Germany's, for example, programs they had a couple of years ago for Syrians and Afghans. We shouldn't forget that this is not the first war, the Russian-Ukraine war. This is not the first war we are facing, and it's not going to be the last war. So really many thanks to all of you for joining us tonight, and our small audience as well. I think at some point we reached 50 to 60 people tonight. Many, many thanks for participating, and I think we should continue this discussion somehow. And it's a pity that because of Corona times, of course, this is only going to be on Zoom, and we cannot continue the discussion afterwards in person. Many thanks, and have a good night.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.